Let's bring in my colleague Adam Walters, who was in Bali reporting on the bombings 20 years ago. And Adam, obviously it's really difficult to grasp that this was 2 decades ago now. This is a moment in Australian history that impacted so many of us directly or indirectly, and we've seen from those services today so many memories flooding back.
Very moving, Ash. It's very difficult, in fact, even 20 years later, to sit there and watch the emotion and the tears on the faces of those loved ones who don't have to wait for anniversaries to feel the pain from day to day, as John Howard mentioned. For myself personally, as a journalist, it was a life-changing experience. My initial reaction at the time, I was at Channel 9, was one of utter disbelief. I mean, Australians and their familiarity with terrorism have been confined until then to stories from distant lands. You know, there was the attack at Munich, the Lockerbie Air disaster, the series of stories through the 70s about the IRA's activities in the UK. But for this to happen on our doorstep, another Australian state by proxy, if you like. I mean, it's like the Gold Coast for people living in WA. A very popular annual destination, was just so deeply shocking. In fact, the early reports about the explosion speculated that it may have been a gas cylinder. The reports were sketchy, and as time went on, it became clear the absolute horror and scale of this. And it's interesting to see John Howard there. Throughout his prime ministership, he had to deal with the Bali bombings, the Port Arthur massacre. He was, of course, famously in the United States when September 11 happened. And as a prime minister, he carried the nation's grief in so many respects. Until then, he was seen as a flint-hard, tough, professional politician who'd risen above Andrew Peacock to lead the Liberal Party and become a Conservative Prime Minister. But the John Howard that I saw in Bali was extremely compassionate. There's one episode in particular involving a truckie from Victoria, a bloke by the name of Dave Spike Stewart. Now, Spike was over there looking for his son, Anthony. He knew that he wasn't going to find him alive, but he wasn't going to leave Bali without him. And was staying at the Hard Rock Hotel, all the media, and most of the victims' families. And Ash, unlike a lot of stories that we cover involving terrible grief, we were immersed in grief. It was literally in the cabanas, the swimming pools, in the bars after work when we go to let some steam off after a heavy day of reporting, and trips to the morgue, interviewing families who are in search of their loved ones. And there's one interview that I did that sticks out in my mind with the very high-profile Eastern Suburbs rooster, Craig Salvatore. I interviewed him briefly at Denpasar Airport as he was putting his 2 little girls on the plane. They'd seen their mother, Kathy, for the last time, and Craig was heading back to the morgue to see whether he could make a positive identification, trying to keep the spirits of his kids up, who were constantly asking about their mother's whereabouts. Just terrible stuff. But Spike Stewart turned up to the Hard Rock Hotel in thongs and a Kubra hat, and he was scheduled to have a meeting with Department of Foreign Affairs officials about the whereabouts of his son, but he wasn't prepared to wait for that. And I'll never forget how he crashed into a media conference and confronted John Howard personally. He stood up, announced who he was, and wanted answers about the process of identifying those Australians who were still missing. And John Howard stood there, his eyes watering, absorbing every single word from this poor man who passed away in 2017, and promised him that he'd have an answer by the end of the day, and he did. And within hours, we were learning that Spike's pilgrimage to Bali was going to be financed by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for as long as it took for him to get answers. And that's just one of so many stories, 2 stories, Craig Salvatore's tragedy, of course, that stick out in my mind. And personally, I knew families from my hometown of Wagga who were impacted heavily by this. We heard in the service there at Coogee about the loss of Dave Mavridis. I knew his sister Jane, and I was in constant touch with her for years after the tragedy, and I can vouch for her as just one of the victims' relatives who who just continue to battle with a huge hole in their soul. This story was on a scale that no one had imagined, Ash. Certainly the biggest story I think this country had encountered since the Second World War. That was certainly the feeling of this at the time. 88 Australians. A month earlier, the Defence Minister, Robert Hill, had announced the formation of an East Coast counter-terrorism unit with the 2nd RAR at the Holsworthy Army Base to prepare for a terrorist/hostage situation on our own soil, but no one could have imagined that just 4 weeks later we'd be confronted with a tragedy on such a brutal, horrendous scale.
There are just so many heart-wrenching stories, Adam. I remember being a viewer watching actually Sky News on the day and being very frustrated because thinking back 20 years ago, the way that television news was delivered was actually very different, and there was very few new pictures coming through. There was little information, and I remember being very frustrated, wanting more information and not being able to get it. And I was so keen for information because I was sitting with one of my best friends who, her boyfriend, John and Wade, was one of the Kingsley boys who never came home. It took us a few weeks to have confirmation that he had died in that attack. But as a journalist there, it must have been chaotic in those early days, trying to verify a lot of that information and get those messages home.
It was, Ash. It was absolutely chaotic. In fact, DFAT had put on a plane, a jumbo jet, for the media to fly out of Sydney at 2 o'clock on the Sunday afternoon after the bombings the night before. And ridiculously, I'm still in a suit. So I'm landing in Denpasar in equatorial humidity, staying at a hotel in the middle of nowhere. I'd been to Bali only once before, about 10 years earlier, when the place still had gravel roads. And the idea of getting a huge story back via satellite dishes to Sydney by that 6 p.m. deadline, which used to exist then and prevail long before we saw the ubiquity of live crosses and live television. It was just such a huge challenge logistically. And that's why we ended up at the Hard Rock Hotel, a seemingly ridiculous setting for a story of such profound suffering. It was ludicrous, surreal even. It was very faithful to the rock and roll theme. There were giant statues of music legends like the Rolling Stones and Roy Orbison, but they, I remember recalling, were dwarfed by death as the families of the missing victims would shuffle past on their way to the Disaster Victims Identification Centre, which was a conference room within the hotel, with every step weighted down by the great gravity of grief. And we'd see these same people at the hotel 24/7, and much of the time they would seek the company of journalists as fellow Australians who would be willing to listen to what they were going through. So it wasn't just reporting the story, it was becoming a confidant at times, and at a highly emotional time for these people who, many of whom had never been to Bali, were totally unfamiliar with the culture, the procedures, let alone a way in which to deal with such profound loss.
Yeah, no doubt totally unprepared for what they faced there in Bali on the ground. Adam Waters, really appreciate you sharing your insights from that time, a moment in time that affected so many Australians and Indonesians, of course.